December 20th, 1944, Stavlet, Belgium. The snow is new enough to squeak under boots, but already grey at the edges, where jeeps nose through the slush, exhaust ghosting in the air. A pair of American military policemen have dragged oil drums into the road and painted a makeshift stop line across the ice. Their job is simple and impossible at once. Tell friend from foe in a war where the enemy suddenly speaks English, drives American trucks, and salutes with the easy slouch of G. Is the first clue that something is wrong, comes with a map unfolded upside down. The second is the way the driver says a place name, hard where it should be soft. The third is a question that no field manual ever wrote, but which will, for a few strange days, become as decisive as a password. The MP taps the windshield with his baton and asks, almost conversationally, who won last season's professional football championship and how many points a field goal is worth. The driver blinks for a fraction too long. He knows the shape of the answer, but not its weight. He gambles, guesses wrong, and the men in the jeep are ordered to step out with their hands up. In a battle, famous for tanks grinding through forests and artillery tearing villages apart, a simple question about the NFL becomes a tool of counterintelligence. That is the heart of this story. How a culture thin details sports in peacetime. America helped unmask trained infiltrators, and how, for 48 tense hours during the Battle of the Bulge, knowledge of a league schedule and a scoring rule could spell the difference between a clear road and a firing squad. The attack that made such questions necessary began at 5:30 on December 16, 1944. When German artillery rippled across a front, the Americans considered quiet. What the U.S. intelligence picture didn't foresee in full was the way one German special mission would try to eat the American nervous system from the inside. Operation Greif, planned under SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, aimed to throw a handful of English-speaking commandos in American uniforms behind the lines to misdirect traffic, swap road signs, blow bridges, and spread rumors. In a war measured in tonnage and divisions, the scale seems almost trivial. Contemporary accounts indicate that while Skorzeny had requested thousands of English speakers, he assembled only a few hundred men with usable language skills after a rushed screening process. Within that pool, the sabotage element Teenheit Stielerfield, roughly a company's worth of operatives who would actually wear American uniforms and drive captured vehicles. Even the German estimate was cautious. This was an economy of force deception, designed to steer the much larger offensive toward bridges over the Meuse by inducing American paralysis. The tactic was familiar: false flags, spoofed signals, fake orders, but the medium was new to the Americans on the Western Front. Their own culture, thrown back at them by adversaries, schooled just enough in American slang to be dangerous. The first day the commando teams move is the first day MPs begin hearing things that don't fit. A jeep with a driver who calls the gasoline benzene. A corporal who says lieutenant as if he grew up in Surrey, not St. Louis. A scout who knows the right jacket size and bootlaces, but cannot fold a road map the way every motor pool sergeant teaches by rote. None of these are proofs. War scrambles language. Units attach and detach. A man can pick up a Canadian vowel in Naples, or a Boston G sound in a week. Officers at 1st Army Headquarters face a harder problem than simple accent. They must build an identification protocol on the fly that a 20-year-old MP can use. At night, in sleet, under the pressure of an armored column stacking up behind him. The first version is exactly what it must be. Crude, but fast. Check paybooks, examine dog tags, compare unit codes. Ask for a chain of command to levels up. The problem is that Operation Greif has anticipated some of that and carries forged documents. The solution, improvised at roadblocks from UPAN to WE, is to pivot into a narrower lane of knowledge life, details that Americans absorb without ever memorizing because they live inside them. State capitals, which side of the road you drive on. Which coin has a portrait of Jefferson? Names of gas stations and hardware stores. And yes, the questions soldiers trade for fun, in mess lines and on trains. Who won the World Series? How many points for an extra point? What team leads the Professional Football League? In the Ardennes of late 1944, football is not an abstraction. It is part of the rhythm of Sundays, and a convenient test because the answers are specific, recent, and oddly hard to fake. A man who learned English in a language school near Dresden can memorize Springfield as the capital of Illinois if he has a list. He can be coached that Americans drive on the right. But knowing who clinched last season's professional title and where the game was played requires a different kind of exposure. The ambient knowledge someone picks up from radio chatter, newsreels, and a dozen small conversations. It reveals whether the mind behind the uniform has lived in the country being impersonated. MPs spread techniques later captured in reports and memoirs. Toss out a casual sports question and watch the reaction. A genuine GI might argue, correct the date, or give you the score. A coached infiltrator will answer too quickly or too slowly, as if stepping across stones he hopes are dry. The method is not foolproof, and no one treats it as such. It is one tool among many. But in those feverish days, it is used often enough to become legend. The day after the offensive begins, American rear areas start to feel the commando ripple. Traffic control reports a rash of misleading signs. A bridge is found wired for demolition in a sector that had been quiet for weeks. Rumors sprint faster than couriers. The Germans have taken American uniforms in whole trains. The Germans have a radio net on our frequencies. The Germans are flying captured C-47s to drop paratroopers on our supply dumps. First Army issues a sober set of countermeasures while clarifying that the uniform masquerade is real but limited. The checkpoint blossoms into doctrine with handwritten rules posted on fence pickets. Stop everyone not immediately known. Ask short questions, vary them. Never let embarrassment tilt a decision. If a two-star general bristles at being quizzed, quiz him anyway. That, too, happens. The most famous instance, corroborated by later recollections, has Lieutenant General Omar Bradley halted long enough at a checkpoint for MPs to ask him the capital of his home state. Bradley says Springfield, and then chuckles when he hears that German infiltrators have been answering Chicago. Eisenhower's driver will later recall delays and a tightening security bubble around the Supreme Commander so intense that Ike effectively becomes a prisoner of his own headquarters for several days while assassination rumors swirl. The irony is sharp. To protect the brain of the Allied coalition from a handful of German commandos. American sentries must treat everyone, for a little while, as possibly foreign. Inside Skorzeny's small bands, the improvisation is just as frantic. Their orders are specific point traffic the wrong way. Cut phone lines, feed a rumor into a QAnd. Their exposure is immediate. A jeep that has passed 2 roadblocks cannot assume safety at the third, because the third has different sentries who have learned new tricks. The best German English speakers can carry a conversation. Many cannot. In the cold, they make tactical errors that are less about language than about habit. A soldier trained on German vehicles reaches for a handbrake where an American would not. A man who learned to march on right-hand roads hesitates at a roundabout. Skorzeny's after-action report, written months later for German readers who wanted a miracle, frames the operation as a success that sowed chaos far out of proportion to its size. American records, written with the calm of hindsight, are stingier, emphasizing that the commando teams caused local confusion and cost some hours, but did not bend the campaign's arc. The truth sits between those poles in a shape that metrics can sketch. Frontline unit journals record delays at bridges measured in tens of minutes, not days. The number of captured commandos reaches into the dozens. Some are executed after quick courts-martial under the law of war governing spies in enemy uniform. Others are sent to prisoner cages where English-speaking American interrogators pry at their training and routes. What cannot be counted precisely is the psychological cost the deception imposes. Soldiers begin to see menace not only across the line, but on their own shoulders. The sports question fits the moment, because it both tests and calms. In one account from a traffic control detachment south of Normandy, a jittery private stammers when asked who won the last pro championship. His sergeant snorts and answers for him, adding a comment about the line's yardage battle that transforms the checkpoint from an inquisition into a barn talk on a winter Sunday. The Germans trapped in this game run out of rope, not because they haven't studied, but because the walls keep shifting. Ask them the capital of Kansas, and they may answer Topeka correctly from a memorized list. Ask them which stadium the professional title game was played in, and they will shuffle feet because the venue has changed over the years, and they haven't lived in those changes. Ask them how many points a field goal counts, and they will freeze, because, although that rule seems basic to an American, it does not exist in their sports grammar. A rifle, a jeep, a forged passol can be acquired. A childhood cannot. To see the Czech's power, you have to see its limits. Not every American soldier knows the standings. Many couldn't name the teams beyond those from their home states. One armored sergeant swears the league's schedule pauses for the harvest. Another thinks a particular franchise still plays under a name that changed before he enlisted. MPs learn quickly not to turn the method into an answer key, but to use it as an observation drill. Does the man argue a point about a team with the loose certainty of someone who has listened to radio announcers for years? Does he laugh at the question in a way that says the absurdity is shared, not performed? Does he answer too perfectly, as if reciting a phrase, because in wartime only a spy is perfect? The mindset watching how, not only what turns a trivia query into a filter. The same applies to other cultural checks, spreading along the road network. Brand names, coin faces, a Hollywood actor's first name, each creates a small, safe controversy that a genuine American will handle, like a reflex, and a trained stranger will treat like a test. The larger machine around these little dramas is the American rear area system that can absorb shocks and learn. The 1st Army Provost Marshal's office pushes messages outward in hours, not days, standardizing the way checkpoints record and pass suspicions. Division staff change march tables to account for delays, and assign extra MPs at critical intersections so armored regiments do not chew up time idling behind interrogations. Engineers put physical choke points where the terrain allows a narrow bridge. A hairpin in a village so vehicles must slow long enough for a question to land. Signal units tighten authentication procedures, migrating to challenge and reply pairs that change more frequently, and embed phonetic traps in the words. A key metric tells the tale. By December 20th and 21st, the initial spike in captured infiltrators tails off, not because the operation has worked, but because the lanes the Germans relied on have been narrowed to pinholes. The football question is part of that system. It is not a talisman. It is a reminder that armies fight with culture too. Skorzeny's own post-war self-portrait, crafted in trials and interviews, burnishes Operation Greif into a strategic masterstroke. The record is cooler. Even German staff officers, writing privately in early 1945, note that the commando teams achieved a tactical nuisance and an intelligence harvest of some maps and fuel, but could not hold bridges or steer an entire corps. American units at Elsenborn Ridge, St. Vith, and Bastogne places, where the battle's outcome is decided, fight a conventional fight of artillery, infantry, and armor, with the deception no more than background noise. Yet the background matters. When MPs are stopping every vehicle and quizzing lieutenants about ball games, a staff car with a critical order arrives 15 minutes later at a battalion command post, when a rumor about paratroopers in American uniforms races down a phone line. A town prepares for a raid that never comes, and the men who would have been warming radios instead tramp a perimeter in boots. Multiply those increments by hundreds of intersections, and you get a fog of tiny losses that, had they favored the attacker more, might have created openings where none appeared. The real value of the cultural check is that it blunts that fog's edge. It gives the sentry a lever he can pull quickly without a printed sheet. The human edge of the story is sharpest in the fragments. An MP in the 30th Infantry Division remembers the first time he hears about Germans in American jackets and thinks it a cruel joke until a jeep rolls up with a driver whose hair is trimmed in a barracks-style no. American barber uses a tanker from the 3rd. Armored Division recalls a buddy stopping a trio of engineers and asking who plays center for a Philadelphia team, purely out of local pride. Then telling the same story for years after, because the engineers and the buddy ended up laughing about how the war had become a sports bar. A captured German, interrogated days later under the routine of name, rank, serial number, and the more pointed dance of how he learned English. admits that the trickiest part of the training was not vocabulary, but rhythm. When to shrug, when to interrupt, how to speak carelessly. Language schools had drilled him on ranks and courtesies. They had not taught him the shape of Saturday, the cadence of a league table, the way men in mess lines flip from box scores to letters from home without changing temperature. Critics of the sports question law point out, rightly, that such checks were not universal, and that many of the commonly retold vignettes have been polished in memory. Records vary on how often a specific question about the professional championship or a particular team actually precipitated an arrest rather than simply color, suspicion already raised by papers, accents, and roots. That makes the method no less real. It lived in the judgments of thousands of sentries who had to be decisive without becoming trigger-happy. Even the near misses prove the point. More than one American officer finds himself detained briefly because he flubs a speed question on an unfamiliar state road, or because an MP asks him a sports question about a town he has never visited. Those moments are awkward, sometimes comic in retrospect, but they underscore the institutional balance the Americans achieve in 2 or 3 days. Aggressive screening without fracture. Measuring results in a deception fight is always slippery, but one hard metric points to a clear story arc. From the 16th through the 19th, reports of suspected infiltrators flood up the chain, clogging logbooks. By the 21st, 5 days into the offensive, the rate of confirmed captures is lower, the quality of leads higher, the panic steadier. The first wave of German teams has been chewed up by the very net they sought to exploit. The second wave barely moves. Bridges the Germans hoped to reach are in American hands. Routes planned in daylight now snake through villages where every second man is a sentry. The fear remains, but its shape changes. It hardens into procedure. The question about football recedes into the toolkit, while the fight moves toward a conventional infantry grind in siege weather. At the end of the month, when the Bulge has reversed into a German pocket under relentless Allied artillery, the surviving members of Einheitsstile write their own histories, some in British cages, some in American. In those papers, the infiltrators complain less about questions than about cold and fuel. They talk about roadblocks as if they were living animals, appearing where no roadblock stood before. They say, with a mix of pride and bitterness, that they made the Americans chase their tails for a while. American reports say, with a mix of understatement and relief, that the deception was contained. Neither side lingers on the cultural gatekeeping that defined those first hours because it sits uneasily with military theory. There is no table in a field manual for the margin of safety provided by knowing whether Cleveland has a football club or how many points a field goal yields. There is no staff course lecture on the operational value of a young man's habit of listening to Sunday broadcasts. Yet the lesson is robust, and you can write it clean. In coalition warfare on rich, literate fronts, cultural detail is not cosmetic. It is armor. The Americans had an advantage the Germans could not match in December 1944, a shallow, ubiquitous culture carried by radio, movies, and newspapers, shared across millions. That gave MPs a set of keys for doors that could not be secured by documents alone. The Germans had good forgers and clever operatives. They did not have the years of ambient exposure that let a farm kid from Iowa describe the sound a crowd makes when a field goal is kicked on a cold day in New York. The value of that difference can be normalized, the way logisticians normalize fuel. If each successful cultural check saved 10 minutes at a checkpoint, and if 1,000 vehicles passed those points in a day, the net time recovered for a division's march could be measured in hours. Hours in a winter counteroffensive are not decoration. They are survival. There is another lesson that cuts the other way. The sports question became famous because it was memorable, because it let soldiers tell the story of how they used something ordinary to fight something strange. But it also hid the grim edge of the law. The men who failed those checks and were caught in American uniform with sabotage orders faced trials and, in some cases, execution by firing squad, an outcome provided for in the laws of war when combatants operate behind enemy lines in enemy dress. The road from a wrong answer to a blindfold could be short. The battlefield mercy of those days lay in professionalism. Most arrests fed into interrogations where a dozen other facts decided the fate. The question at the roadblock was the match that lit the fuse. It was not, by itself, the explosive. The memory of those days lived strangely. Veterans remember the cold first, the short afternoons and long nights. They remember whitewash on pine trunks to break silhouettes, and the way the Ardennes villages smelled of coal and cabbage. And then they remember the conversations. The kid from Ohio who jawed with a stranger about a backfield. The lieutenant from New England who could not believe he was asking a colonel a trivia question. The grizzled MP who thought the whole idea silly until it worked twice in one shift. When the front stabilizes and the counterattack begins to bite back into the German salient, those memories sit at the edge of official accounts, decorative but true. They matter because they show the mind of an army under stress, adapting with what it has at hand. If you strip this episode down to its operational thesis, it reads clean and spare. A small German deception multiplied uncertainty at the American rear. The American response, improvised and then standardized, compressed that uncertainty back into manageable noise. The compression depended not only on documents and passwords, but on tests of lived knowledge that a pretender could not easily fake. The professional football question was one such test. Quick to ask, easy to vary, hard to answer without having shared the culture it sprang from. It was not the only factor that exposed infiltrators. It was not even the most powerful one, if you tally captures against causes. But it stands as a clear example of how, in modern war, the mundane becomes material. A Sunday habit becomes a screen. A scoring rule becomes a defense. And in a frozen forest in Belgium, where roads mattered more than maps and time, was the one resource no staff could requisition. That was enough to make a difference. What endures is not the score of any game or the name of any champion, but the recognition that armies are not just shells and steel. They are memory devices. They carry a nation's rhythms forward, to the edge of danger and back. In December 1944, the United States Army carried with it the sound of a voice on a radio, calling plays to a country spread across plains and city blocks. And that sound, echoed in a checkpoint question, helped it defend a supply route long enough for tanks to reach the crossroads where the real fighting raged. There is nothing romantic in that. There is only the plain truth that culture, when understood as a network of shared facts and habits, can be as sharp an instrument of security as any badge or bolt. In a war rich with weapons and poor in certainty, a simple question asked by a young man with a baton and a cold nose peeled back a disguise that uniforms and paperwork had almost made perfect. The disguise failed not because it was badly made, but because it could not counterfeit a lifetime. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.